Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. We're in the middle of a series on friendship right now. And one of the things I keep coming back to is this. The depth of our relationships is often shaped by the depth of our communication. And not just what we say, but how we say it. And even more than that, why we say it. Communication isn't just a skill we learn. It's something that's been formed in us through our stories, our families, our attachment, and the environments that shaped us long before we had language for any of it. In today's conversation, I'm joined by therapist and author Jason VanRuler to explore the different communication patterns we tend to fall into, how those patterns are formed, and what it looks like to grow in self-awareness so that our friendships can actually deepen. We also talk about hard conversations, why they matter, why they're so difficult, and how learning to step into them can become one of the most meaningful pathways to connection. Listen in. Well, Jason, welcome to Faith and Feelings. I'm so glad you're here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, to get started, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and what a typical day looks like for you.
Yeah, well, I'm a therapist, and so have been a therapist for well over a decade now. And so typical days for me are one of a couple different things. So I spend time writing and seeing clients and then speaking and doing intensives. And so what I really love, I tell people I had career ADHD a little bit. And so what I really like is a lot of different things at once. I kind of thrive in that space. And so on any given day, I'm probably doing one of those couple of things.
If we can, I'd love to go back to the earlier parts of your story as much as you're comfortable. And when you think about those early threads in your life, what started to shape your desire to do this work?
Yeah, well, I always tell the story and make the joke that, and I do have it. I have a journal when I was 8 where I wrote down I wanted to be, at that time I wrote psychologist and live in a brownstone and write books. And so it's pretty cool that I had the journal. And I always joke the reason I did that is because I already dressed like a therapist. So I knew I wasn't going to be like a pro basketball player or, I was like, my career options are limited. I'm wearing corduroys and penny loafers. So
yeah, that's funny.
Probably we're going to be a psychologist, but I always knew I did. And I think I was just a reader as a little kid. Like I just read all the time and was really fascinated with why people do what they do. Just from a young age, I was probably a super annoying little kid, but I was like, why do people do that? And so I would just sort of follow adults around saying why all the time. And that mattered a lot. And so that's what I wanted to do. Although I got out of high school, and at that time I thought, well, I'm going to be a painter of all things. I really like to paint throughout high school. And so I was going to be a painter or do something else. And it ended up that I dropped out of school and started a recruiting company. I was in staffing and recruiting and HR. And so I was like, well, this is kind of where I landed. And the reason I wanted to do that is I just always love helping people. And so I had kind of forgotten what I wanted. And this just seemed like the thing that was for me in that season. And so I did that for a while. And then shortly after getting married, just went to my sweet wife and I said, we've got this established business and kind of everything's going great, isn't it? And she was like, yeah, it's going great. I'm like, that's so cool. And I was just thinking about like, what if we just quit the business and I went back to school for like 7 years? And she just she's nodding kind of like
easy decision.
Yeah, she was just like, yeah. And she's like, what would be on the other end of that? And I'm like, well, I'd do an internship and, maybe in like 10 years or so, I'd have a new job. And she's just like, oh, okay. But what was true is I felt called to it. I've always felt called to it. And so it was kind of fun to know it, to lose it, and to find it again. And that's kind of how I ended up here today.
I love that. And I connect with so much of what you said. I was the exact same way as a kid, always reading, always curious about how other people think and why they do what they do. So I love hearing that. And I know you have a new book coming out on communication. And so I'm curious, was there a moment or maybe series of moments when you began to realize just how much communication can either build or erode connection?
Mm. Boy, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, as somebody, as a child, had a pretty idyllic childhood, and then parents divorced at 8, and a lot of things in my world changed and became really tumultuous. And so, I would say, like as a kid, there were some standout moments where people said things, and it kind of meant everything. And so I definitely had those times where I look back and I go, like, oh boy, that there was an opportunity there, and it was missed or it was taken, but those words will stay with me. And then I think in helping people with recruiting, I kind of saw like how people approach their job and talk about that, like that can either make or break it. And then as a therapist now, and also someone who's married and got kiddos, I just have seen so many times in a coupleship or on a team where it's kind of everything at stake, and you can get it right or you can get it wrong. And so, because just like you, I'm fascinated by, well, what happened there? That started to kind of drive this question of like, something's going on. I don't really get what's happening, but I want to know what it is so we can address it differently.
Yeah, I love that. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your new book. It's called Discovering Your Communication Types and Relationships. Mm-hmm. So what was the burden or desire that led you to write this book? What was stirring in you?
Yeah, it sounds a little maybe cliche or silly, but I really feel like I was called to write it. I really feel like my faith in God was just a really big part of like, I want to help people get better at this. I work with so many people who will come to me and they'll say, Jason, we have a problem. And so I'm always like, okay, what's the problem? And they say, well, it's communication. And I'm like, what does that mean? And they're like, well, communication. And I'm like, I don't think I do. What part of communication? And so I think what I saw over and over again is for a lot of people, it's really an abstract thing. And yet our relationship depends on it. And so I don't know about you, but like if I go back and this isn't like a complaint, but if I go back in my growing up years, they really didn't teach us communication. I don't remember taking that course, or I don't remember anybody saying like, this is how you should do it. And so I think just as I've worked with people, I've felt really compelled to help people do that better, because I think anymore with technology and things like that, our humanity is tied to our ability to have relationships, and our ability to have relationships hangs on our ability to communicate. And so I just thought, boy, if we could get better at that, relationships might be easier and things might change.
Yeah, that's so good. I'd love for you to speak into communication a little bit more. And this is kind of a broad question, so you can take it wherever you want. But when you think about communication, what do you see as the root of the breakdown in relationships?
Yeah, I think it's that we all have different intentions for why we're saying what we're saying. So really the book is about this idea that there's kind of 5 different types of communication. And what I mean by that is the why. So like you and I are talking today, we could choose any words we wanted. We could talk about anything we wanted. So why are we talking about what we're talking about? And why are we saying what we're saying? And so what I found is there were some predictable patterns that were responsible for the why. And what I found is that if we don't understand the why behind how we communicate, and we communicate with somebody else who has a different why, we have a breakdown. And so like just a great example would be, I tend to be, there's 5 types, one of which is a harbor, and harbors like to communicate about feelings, shocker, right? But we like to talk about our feelings and your feelings. And so that's a wonderful thing. My wife is a thinker, and thinkers like to talk about what's factual, what's accurate, what's logical, and research, and they want to get it right. And so you could probably see how if I'm talking about feelings and she's talking about facts, we might have a breakdown. But I would argue neither one of us want that. It's just not how we approach communication.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I know I told you before we started recording that I had a chance to read your book, and I loved it, especially the different communication types. I thought they were so fascinating. So could you give us maybe a high-level overview of each of these 5 types?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always give a disclaimer. I always say there's no one better than the others. So if you're listening, there's not like a bad one on the list. They're just different things, and they all have a strength and an opportunity. So the acronym is PATHS, and the first one is all about peace, right? So it's a peacemaker, and that language is pretty familiar to most. And the reason is it's just obvious. So that person is communicating because they want there to be peace. And so they're kind of polishing out the rough spots. They're reading your facial expressions. They're going like, how do I make sure that we're keeping things calm and okay? And so that's a strength. The opportunity they have is it's not always peaceful. Sometimes you have a tough conversation and it has to be a little rough or raw. And so that's their opportunity. The A is the advocate, and advocates make great friends because if you've ever been in a situation where you're like, is someone going to say something? They're going to say something. Okay. So advocates are all about what's fair, what's just, what's right. They want to be the person who advocates for self and others. And their opportunity for growth is just that life isn't fair. Like sometimes there's going to be some things that we have to accept and we have to process, and not every fight is our fight. The thinker, like I said, is more factual. I want to get it accurate. I want to get it right. And so that's a really important skill. Their challenge or opportunity is how do I lean into feelings a little more? Because that's not always natural for them. And then how do I, as I process internally as a thinker, how do I let other people know I'm still present? The harbor, like I said, is about feelings. Harbor is creating a safe space. And so that's wonderful. I, probably make a great therapist because I can talk about feelings. But I always joke with people that it makes me a weird dinner party guest, because I'll go to the dinner party and someone will say, hi, I'm so-and-so. And they'll ask me a question. And I'm like, tell me about your mother. Tell me about how you feel about your childhood. And so then my friends will say, Jason, what are you doing? And I'll be like, what do you mean? And they're like, I think that person was crying. And I'm like, well, they weren't crying that much, and they're like, what did you say to them? And I was like, well, I just was talking about their feelings. And so what our job is to learn is feelings aren't always the thing that needs to be discussed in every moment. So there's time and place. And then the last one is the spark. And the spark is that charismatic, energetic, kind of magnetic person that's fun. And fun is so important. But their opportunity for growth is to slow down and sometimes make space for the serious stuff. And so what I kind of argued is that we all have a primary and a secondary, which just means one's kind of our go-to, and the second one is an accent to that. And when we know that, we know how to communicate differently.
Yeah, that's so good. Thank you for walking us through that. Yeah. One of the things I really loved in your book is how you talk about communication through the lens of attachment. And I'm curious, when you think about these patterns, how do you see them forming in us? What role do our stories, early relationships, and environments play in shaping how we communicate?
Yeah, they have a great role in that, in the sense that I believe a lot of our communication type is really formed in response to what our family needed. And so if you think about, me, I'm a Midwestern guy, grew up in a religious household. It was fairly rigid. We didn't talk about feelings. If you were to go around the dinner table, like there was not a discussion about feelings. And so what did the family really need? Well, they needed somebody to say the thing, right? And so what I learned at an early age is like, well, I can be useful and valuable if I talk about the thing we're not talking about. And likewise, that's where you sort of get the peacemaker. And like, well, if they grow up in a place where it's like, we really need some peace here. We need somebody to level this conversation out. I believe a lot of us just sort of learned early on, this is the role that we're going to play. And we develop communication around that.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, one of the themes we've been exploring on the podcast right now is friendship, and specifically how we develop deep and lasting friendships. And I'd love for you to speak into that from a communication standpoint. Yeah. So when you think about friendships that really last, What feels different about how people communicate in those relationships?
Yeah, that's a good thing to think through because I think a lot of us can be good starters at relationships. I always believe there's starters and sustainers, and we always have an easier time with one than the other, right? And so it might be like, well, I can start any relationship. I'm really good at that. And you go, can you make it last? And some people are like, I actually don't know how to do that, or I can make a relationship last, but I'm not great at starting it. And and so what I'd say is the skill set to keep it going is to have depth. And that's, I think, something that we have to practice because depth requires some self awareness and it requires also being able to understand where somebody else is coming from. And so the relationships, whether it be a friendship or otherwise, that last the longest are the ones where we're able to be vulnerable and to go deep, but to do it in a way that actually serves the relationship. And that's not always something we know, right? Because you have to have some boundaries and you have to have some ability to communicate about feelings and thoughts and things that actually give somebody something to work with.
One of the things I loved in your book is how you talk about having hard conversations. And from my experience, in friendships that last and deepen, those conversations feel essential.
I don't like that though. Do you? I wish that wasn't the case.
I don't like that at all. I really wish that wasn't the case, but it does seem true.
Now I'll tell you a book that would sell is if we were like how to have the conflict-less relationship. Let's have relationships.
Yes, exactly.
Like, I'm buying that book. That's awesome. I want that.
Yeah. I think for me, I really connect with the peacemaker type. So conflict can be really hard to step into. And so for those of us who struggle with conflict, what does it look like to prepare internally to enter those harder conversations?
Yeah, I think you have to make it smaller than you probably naturally are going to look at it. So I think if we don't like to do that, we have this tendency to kind of blow it up more than it needs to be. And so what we'll do is we'll overcomplicate it, or we'll make it about 2 or 3 or 4 different things, or we'll kind of think through like, what if this took hours? And so what I usually tell people is like, just make it ridiculously small. So start there. So like, what is the smallest version of what's going on that you could talk about? And if you can talk about the smallest version, what's usually true is that people usually kind of right the ship. So if you talk about the smallest version and you can get through that conversation, most people self-regulate enough that they go, okay, well, I'll internalize that and process it. You didn't have to give me all the examples. The other thing is if you can do it small, then you don't usually have to do it big. Because the reason we usually have to do the big conflict is because we neglected to do the small. And so when we can get really, really good at just having kind of a quick turnover, my running coach always used to say, quick turnover with my feet. He'd say, get your feet going, get them kicked up. And so if we can kind of have that quick turnover with conflict, we don't ever really have to have the big stuff.
Do you have an example or maybe a personal story of a time when you stepped into a hard conversation and used some of these skills?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a great example that actually comes from a friendship and really what I would argue is my best friend. It took me a long time to make a best friend, but of course I made a best friend who's a therapist. And so I'm talking to him and we'd been interacting and I've been really busy and I just sort of missed some calls. I was like, yeah, we're going to connect or we're going to do this. And I just hadn't. And so, I had my reasons and it wasn't personal, but I had not done what I said I was going to do. And this person actually said to me, and it caught me so off guard. He was just like, hey, we got to have kind of a hard conversation. And I'm like, well, about what? What are we going to talk about? And he's like, I was just kind of hurt that you didn't do this. And I thought, oh man, okay, because I don't want to hurt anybody and I'm not trying to do this. But what I tried to bring back is this isn't about my worth. This isn't a thing that has to be any bigger than it is. And this is a person who cares enough to say the truth to me and let me work it out with them. And so I just tried to say, okay, so I'm just going to be present here. And what I tried to do is just be curious and to listen and just go, I'm going to collect a bunch of data and then I'm going to weigh in on it. And what I found, and the reason this person is my best friend is what I found is like, he wanted to work it out. He's just like, hey, I think being a good friend means saying the thing. And he's like, I don't want to say it either. I don't want to be having this conversation. But he's like, if we're going to be in relationship, it matters that we can tell the truth. And so all in, that was probably a 10-minute deal. But I will tell you that strengthened the relationship in a way I haven't really had other friendships.
Yeah. Wow. Any other on-ramps you'd suggest for people stepping into hard conversations? Ways to maybe invite connection instead of defensiveness?
Yeah, I think, I would say 9 out of 10 times when someone wants to have a hard conversation, it's because they want to still have a relationship. People who don't want relationship don't want conversation. And so I think if you can remind yourself that this person actually wants to be closer to me at the end of this, that's really helpful. And the other thing is that this person wants to hear my version of what happened. And so if you go, man, they want a relationship, they want to hear my version, it kind of feels then like, wow, this is an easy place to show up. We might disagree, might see it differently, but at the end of it, we both kind of want the same outcome. So I think if you can remind yourself of that, if it feels like, well, we don't want the same outcome, that's a different story. But I think in most friendships, a person is saying it because you matter enough for it to be said. And I think also just understanding they probably don't want to do it either. There are very few people who are like, I want to be confrontational all the time. There are some, but you have to kind of honor compassion of they don't want to do this either, but they obviously think it's necessary. So we should probably lean into it.
That's really good. I've experienced something similar in a close friendship. And at first, hard conversations felt really awkward. And we just kind of named that, like, this feels really awkward. But over time, as we kept leaning in, it got easier. Our capacity for those conversations grew. And now it feels so much more natural. I love what you said about how bringing something up is actually a sign that someone wants connection.
Yeah. And I love what you said too about it. It gets easier because I think, like you said, capacity, but then what's interesting is even our criteria for what makes a hard conversation is a little different, right? So if we're out of practice and we haven't had a hard conversation for years, anything is going to be a hard conversation, right? Anything other than yes is like, this is the biggest conversation I'll ever have. But if you get in a rhythm like you're talking about, where you're just like, we're quick to address it, all of a sudden you start to look at it and go, I don't even know if this is that hard of a conversation. It was just kind of a disagreement, or we had an off day, or it's funny how we start to perceive it differently.
That's so true. As we wrap up, is there anything else you'd want listeners to know about your book or take away from it?
Yeah, I mean, and we touched a little bit, and I would just say there's a lot to read there, but the attachment stuff is important. I mean, it's your story really does inform why you communicate the way you do, and I guess what I would want to tell people is that doesn't make you a bad person. It just means it's how you learn to operate. And so when we can kind of honor who we are and who others are, I think connection is possible, and I kind of come back to this idea of, a good communicator understands himself, right? We know how what we say lands and what people think, but a great communicator understands other people. And so my sincere hope for the book is it makes you great, not just good. And I think that's possible for all of us. Even if someone's listening and they're like, but Jason, I'm the worst. I'd say, well, you got to prove that. I've seen a lot of struggle, but you're probably not the worst. You just probably haven't had the experience and the practice. So let's practice.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, I think when this episode releases, your book will be coming out the next day. So where can people find it and how can people connect with you?
Yeah, they can find it anywhere books are sold, and Amazon or all those different places. And then you can find more out about it on my website, which is jasonvr.com. And actually, you can take the free paths assessment, and so you can figure out which one of the types you're most aligned with. And so if you want to try that out, that's a great place to start.
Well, I'll include the link to your book in the show notes so listeners can check it out. But thank you so much for your time today, Jason. It was really good to be with you.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. This was fantastic.
As we close, I hope this episode gave you a little bit of space, not just to think about communication as a concept, but to notice your own patterns and how your story has shaped the way you show up to your friendships. Because so much of growth doesn't begin with change, it begins with awareness, with slowing down enough to notice what's actually happening inside of us when we connect or when we struggle to connect. And so this week, you might gently ask yourself, where in my relationships do I feel most myself? And where do I feel like I shift or pull back? And what might my communication patterns be trying to protect or trying to reach for? I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.